"You only care about my husband's money," my daughter-in-law said during the will reading. My son lowered his eyes and said nothing. That was the moment I realized I had not only buried my husband 3 days earlier, I had also lost the family I spent 42 years building with him. I'm Evelyn Harper. I'm 71 years old, and until last week, I believed grief was the worst pain a woman could survive. I was wrong. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of leather and coffee, the kind of expensive silence rich people mistake for comfort. Outside the tall windows, rain slid slowly down the glass, turning downtown Chicago into a blur of gray lights and wet pavement. Arthur always loved rainy afternoons. He used to say storms made the city honest. Rain washes away the performance, he would tell me while standing beside our penthouse window with a glass of bourbon in his hand. Now he was gone, and the only thing being washed away was me. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat softly as he opened the folder containing Arthur's will. Across from me sat my son Daniel and his wife Vanessa. Daniel looked exhausted, but not from grief. It was the exhaustion of a man trying not to think too deeply. Vanessa, on the other hand, looked immaculate. Her cream-colored blazer probably cost more than my first car. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled, her makeup untouched despite the funeral tears she displayed so beautifully 2 days ago in front of the guests. She had always known exactly when to cry and exactly who needed to see it. Arthur Harper's estate includes the Lake Forest property, investment accounts, company shares, and trust holdings. Mr. Collins began carefully. Vanessa's fingers tightened around Daniel's hand. I noticed it immediately. Not affection. Anticipation. Arthur built Harper Industrial from nothing. 40 years ago, we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a grocery store, while he worked 16-hour days trying to keep the company alive. I answered customer calls from our kitchen table, while rocking Daniel in a second-hand baby swing with my foot. We survived layoffs, recessions, lawsuits, and the terrifying winter Arthur nearly lost everything after a supplier backed out. There were nights we split one bowl of soup because we couldn't afford groceries until Friday. We built that life together, brick by brick, year by year. Yet somehow, sitting in that office, I already felt like a stranger listening to another family discuss their inheritance. As outlined in the primary trust, Mr. Collins continued, certain assets will remain under shared family management until further conditions are met. Vanessa let out a quiet sigh, impatient. She crossed one leg over the other and glanced toward Daniel with the same expression she used whenever a waiter took too long bringing wine at restaurants. Then she looked directly at me. "Honestly," she said with a thin smile, "I think we all know what this is really about." The room became very still. Mr. Collins stopped speaking. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her but didn't interrupt. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "You only care about my husband's money." Her words landed softly. That was the worst part. Not screamed. Not emotional. Calm. Precise. Like she had rehearsed them in advance. I stared at her for a moment, certain I must have misunderstood. But then Daniel looked away instead of defending me, and I understood everything all at once. Every holiday Vanessa insisted on hosting without me. Every family trip I somehow learned about from Facebook photos afterward. Every birthday dinner Daniel suddenly became too busy to attend after marrying her. It had never been accidental. Vanessa had been slowly removing me from my own family for years, and I had been too busy trying to keep the peace to notice. "Vanessa," Mr. Collins said quietly, clearly uncomfortable, but she only shrugged. Someone had to say it. Daniel rubbed his forehead without looking at me. "Mom, she didn't mean it like that." But she did. We all knew she did. I looked down at my wedding ring, slowly turning it around my finger the way I always did when I was anxious. Arthur gave me that ring in 1978 outside a tiny Italian restaurant after proposing with trembling hands because he couldn't yet afford diamonds larger than a raindrop. I still remembered exactly how his voice sounded when he promised me we would grow old together. And we did. Until a heart attack took him in less than 4 minutes while I stood helpless beside him in our kitchen. 42 years reduced to a death certificate and a lawyer's office. My chest ached, but I refused to cry in front of Vanessa. That would have pleased her too much. Instead, I lifted my eyes and looked around the room carefully. At the polished table. At the expensive artwork. At my son refusing to meet my gaze. And for the first time since Arthur died, something inside me became very cold. Because Arthur had spent his entire life preparing for every possible threat to this family, even the ones wearing his last name. I did not speak again for the rest of the meeting. Neither did Daniel. Mr. Collins continued reading through the legal documents in a careful, measured voice, but the warmth had disappeared from the room completely. Every sentence now sounded distant to me, like I was underwater listening to strangers discuss someone else's life. Vanessa occasionally nodded when certain assets were mentioned. The Lake Forest property, the Arizona vacation home, Harper Industrial shares, retirement accounts, jewelry inventory. I noticed the small satisfaction in her expression each time money entered the conversation. Not grief, not respect for Arthur. Relief, as though she had finally reached the finish line after years of waiting. By the time the meeting ended, the rain outside had become heavier. Daniel stood quickly, already checking his phone while Vanessa slipped her designer coat over her shoulders. She looked refreshed somehow, energized by the afternoon. "We should all get dinner sometime next week," she said casually, as if she had not just humiliated me 20 minutes earlier. "Things have been emotional lately." Emotional? I almost smiled at the word. My husband had died 3 days ago. 42 years of marriage had ended beside a kitchen counter with a dropped coffee mug still stained on the hardwood floor. Emotional was too small a word for what remained inside me. Daniel finally looked at me near the elevator. "Mom, do you need help getting home?" His voice carried the same strained politeness people use with distant relatives at funerals. Not warmth. Obligation. "No," I answered softly. "I drove myself." He nodded immediately, relieved. Vanessa touched his arm lightly, steering him toward the parking garage before he could say anything else. I watched them walk away together beneath the gray Chicago sky, moving quickly under one umbrella while I stood alone beneath the awning outside the building. Daniel never once turned around. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes because of traffic. Arthur used to hate downtown traffic. He always took Lake Shore Drive instead of the freeway whenever possible, because he liked seeing the water, even in winter. I found myself taking the same route automatically. The lake looked cold and metallic beneath the clouds, endless and empty. By the time I reached Lake Forest, dusk had already settled across the neighborhood. The Harper house stood exactly as it always had. Tall white columns, black shutters, perfect landscaping. Arthur insisted on maintaining himself even after we could afford gardeners. We bought the property in 1994, after Harper Industrial landed its first national contract. Arthur stood in the driveway that day laughing like a boy because he could not believe the bank approved us for something so beautiful. "This is where our grandchildren will grow up," he told me. Back then, every room in that house felt alive. Christmas mornings, summer barbecues, Daniel running through the halls in baseball cleats while I yelled about the carpet. Years of ordinary moments layered quietly into a lifetime. Now the house looked too large for one person. Too quiet. I walked inside and immediately noticed something strange. The framed wedding photograph that normally sat on the entry table was gone. I stopped in the foyer, staring at the empty space where it had been for nearly 20 years. Arthur loved that photograph. It was taken during Daniel's wedding reception. Arthur was laughing at something I whispered into his ear while Daniel stood beside us smiling. Vanessa once complained that the frame looked outdated. I remembered that suddenly. Slowly, I set my purse down and walked farther into the house. The silence felt different now. Not peaceful. Rearranged. In the family room, several shelves had been cleared. Arthur's reading glasses were gone from beside his favorite chair. The knitted blanket I made him during the winter he recovered from bypass surgery had disappeared too. I stood there for a long moment trying to understand why the room felt unfamiliar. Then I realized what was missing. Him. Not only his body, his presence. Someone had already started erasing him from the house before the flowers from his funeral had even begun to die. Upstairs, I opened our bedroom door and froze again. Half of Arthur's closet was empty. Several suits were missing. His watches were gone from the dresser drawer. Even the old leather overnight bag he used for business trips had disappeared. I felt something tighten painfully inside my chest. Daniel and Vanessa had keys to the house. They had come here while I was at the lawyer's office. Quietly. efficiently, like people collecting property after an estate sale. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty closet space where Arthur's navy jackets once hung in perfect rows. The room smelled faintly of his cologne still lingering in the fabric of the curtains. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes and could almost hear his voice downstairs asking if I wanted tea before bed. But the house stayed silent. Then my phone vibrated beside me. A message from Vanessa. Daniel and I stopped by earlier to organize some of Arthur's things. We thought it would help you move forward. I read the text twice. Then I looked around the bedroom that no longer felt fully mine. And for the first time since Arthur died, I began to wonder if they were not simply waiting for me to grieve. They were waiting for me to leave. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30 without meaning to. Arthur always woke early, and after 42 years beside him, my body still followed his rhythm even though his side of the bed remained untouched and cold. Pale morning light filtered through the curtains as I sat quietly listening to the house settle around me. Pipes creaked softly somewhere downstairs. Wind brushed against the windows. Beyond that, nothing. No footsteps. No coffee grinder humming in the kitchen. No newspaper landing against the front door. Grief had a strange way of changing silence into something physical. I stayed in bed for several minutes staring at the ceiling before finally reaching for my robe. As I passed Arthur's closet, the empty spaces looked even larger in daylight. Clean gaps where entire sections of his life had been removed. I forced myself downstairs slowly, gripping the handrail harder than usual. The kitchen still smelled faintly like lilies from the funeral arrangements scattered throughout the house. I hated those flowers now. They smelled like sympathy in casseroles and fake voices asking how I was holding up. I started the coffee maker and automatically reached for Arthur's favorite mug before remembering there was no reason to pour a second cup anymore. The realization hit me differently every time. Like grief kept finding new doors into the same wound. While the coffee brewed, I glanced toward the family calendar hanging near the pantry. Vanessa had given it to us 2 Christmases ago because she said digital schedules were more efficient for everyone. Most of the handwriting on it belonged to her now. Dinner reservations, school recitals for the children, charity events, appointments. I noticed several entries for the upcoming weekend written in Vanessa's sharp handwriting. Furniture appraiser, estate planning lunch, realtor walkthrough. I stared at the words for a long moment before slowly setting my coffee cup down. Realtor walkthrough. In this house. My house. The front door opened suddenly, startling me. Daniel walked inside carrying his gym bag and a cardboard drink tray from Starbucks. He froze slightly when he saw me already awake. "Oh," he said quietly. "I did not know you were up." I watched him set the coffees on the counter. Only 2 cups. Not 3. Vanessa entered behind him a moment later wearing expensive workout clothes and spotless white sneakers. Her blonde ponytail swayed as she walked directly to the refrigerator without greeting me first. "Morning," she said casually while checking her phone. Daniel avoided eye contact as he unpacked egg sandwiches from a paper bag. The kitchen that once belonged to Arthur and me suddenly felt like someone else's break room. "Why is there a realtor walkthrough scheduled here?" I asked calmly. Daniel immediately stiffened. Vanessa closed the refrigerator slowly before turning toward me with a practiced expression of concern. "We were going to discuss that with you later," she said smoothly. "Daniel and I just think this house might be too much for one person now." One person now. Such a simple phrase. Still, it landed heavily. Daniel finally looked at me. "Mom, the place is almost 9,000 square feet. It is a lot to manage." I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Your father managed it just fine last month." Silence settled over the kitchen. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Daniel before leaning lightly against the marble counter. "Evelyn, nobody is trying to upset you. We are just thinking about what makes sense financially." Financially. Another word people used when they wanted to remove emotion from cruelty. I looked at my son carefully. He seemed exhausted lately, but not in the way grief exhausted people. He looked pressured, distracted, like a man constantly trying to keep up with someone else's expectations. Vanessa reached for one of the coffee cups and smiled faintly. "Besides," she added, "you do not need all this space anymore." There it was again. Not concern. Reduction. every sentence gently shrinking my place inside the family. I remembered the first Thanksgiving after Daniel married Vanessa 12 years earlier. She redesigned the entire dining room table arrangement because she said traditional seating felt outdated. Arthur laughed it off at the time, but I remembered noticing my seat had quietly moved farther from the center of the table. Small things like that happened constantly after she entered our lives. Family vacations scheduled without asking about my availability. Christmas mornings shortened because Vanessa preferred spending holidays with her own parents. Birthdays forgotten until the following week. Tiny cuts spread across years. Nothing dramatic enough to confront. Just enough to slowly erase someone. I am not selling the house, I said finally. Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, maybe we should at least discuss options. I looked directly at him then. Really looked at him. At the tired eyes. The nervous posture. The man who once cried for 3 hours when he left for summer camp at age 9 because he missed me before the bus even left the parking lot. I wondered when exactly he became someone who could sit quietly while his wife planned my removal from my own home. Vanessa picked up her purse and checked the time. We should go, she said lightly. The children have piano lessons at 10. The children? My grandchildren. I had not seen them since the funeral because Vanessa claimed they needed routine and stability. Another careful exclusion wrapped inside reasonable language. Daniel grabbed his keys slowly. We will talk later, okay? He said without conviction. I nodded once. They left together a minute later, their voices fading down the driveway as the front door closed behind them. Then the house became silent again. I stood alone in the kitchen holding Arthur's coffee mug long after the coffee inside turned cold. That afternoon I wandered through the house slowly, touching things I had not truly looked at in years. The dining room chandelier. Arthur spent 6 weekends installing himself, because he refused to pay electricians for something he believed he could learn from a hardware store manual. The small scratch on the hallway wall from when Daniel crashed his bicycle indoors during a thunderstorm at age 12. The faded pencil marks inside the pantry door measuring our son's height through the years. Every corner of that house held evidence of a life built patiently over decades. Yet suddenly all of it felt temporary, as if I were already visiting memories instead of living among them. I stopped in Arthur's study near the back of the house. It was the one room Vanessa rarely entered because she claimed it smelled like old paper and cigar smoke. Arthur would have considered that a compliment. The room remained almost exactly as he left it. Dark walnut shelves lined with biographies and business journals, framed photographs from company events, a brass desk lamp casting warm amber light across stacks of organized paperwork. Even now, stepping inside felt like stepping into his mind. Careful, ordered, quietly strong. I lowered myself into the leather chair across from his desk and let my eyes settle on the photograph sitting nearest the window. It was taken 15 years ago during a family trip to Martha's Vineyard. Daniel stood beside Arthur holding a fishing rod while Vanessa smiled brightly at the camera in a white sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget at the time. Looking at that photograph now, I realized something unsettling. Vanessa had always looked directly at cameras, even in candid moments, as if she understood instinctively that appearances mattered more than experiences. Arthur noticed it too. I remembered that suddenly. One evening years ago, after Daniel and Vanessa left a Christmas party early because Vanessa was upset her children were not featured enough in the family slideshow, Arthur sat quietly beside me in this very room swirling bourbon in his glass. That woman does not like sharing space, he said calmly. I laughed back then because I thought he was simply annoyed. She loves Daniel, I told him. Arthur stared into his drink for several seconds before answering. Loving someone and wanting to control their world are not always the same thing. At the time I dismissed it. Mothers often make excuses because seeing problems clearly means accepting painful truths. I preferred harmony. I preferred believing family tensions were temporary misunderstandings instead of slow-moving fractures. Looking back now, the signs had been everywhere. Vanessa criticizing every tradition she did not create herself. Vanessa deciding holiday schedules without asking anyone else. Vanessa correcting Daniel publicly until he second-guessed even harmless opinions. Small moments. Constant moments. Once, during Easter brunch 6 years ago, I spent 2 days preparing recipes Arthur loved. Honey glazed ham, Homemade rolls. Lemon pie from scratch. Vanessa arrived 40 minutes late, looked across the table, and casually announced she had already made dinner reservations elsewhere because the children preferred restaurants now. Daniel apologized awkwardly while everyone gathered their coats. I stood alone in the kitchen afterward, scraping untouched food into the trash while Arthur silently dried dishes beside me. He never complained out loud that night, but I remember how tightly he folded the kitchen towel afterward. Another memory surfaced unexpectedly. 2 summers ago during a charity gala, Vanessa introduced Arthur and me to one of her friends from the country club. "These are Daniel's parents," she said brightly. "Not Arthur Harper, founder of Harper Industrial. Not Evelyn. Just Daniel's parents." The wording seemed harmless at the time, yet somehow diminishing. As though we existed only as background characters supporting the newer, more polished version of the family she preferred presenting to the world. I leaned back slowly in the chair and looked around Arthur's study again. He saw more than I realized. That thought settled heavily inside me. Arthur was not a careless man. He negotiated million-dollar contracts without missing hidden clauses. He remembered birthdays for every employee assistant in the company. He noticed when strangers lied to him within seconds. A man like that would not overlook manipulation inside his own family. My eyes drifted toward the lower desk drawer. Locked. Arthur always kept it locked, though he once told me where the spare key was hidden in case of emergencies. I hesitated before standing slowly and crossing the room toward the bookshelf near the fireplace. Behind an old history book sat a small silver key exactly where he said it would be. My fingers tightened around it instantly. The drawer opened with a soft click. Inside rested several neatly stacked folders, Arthur's old reading glasses, and a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in his handwriting. Evelyn. Just that. No note. No explanation. Suddenly my heartbeat felt uneven. Outside, wind rattled softly against the windows while the house remained painfully quiet around me. I stared at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. Then I noticed something else inside the drawer beneath the papers. A second set of documents bearing the Harper Industrial logo and the signature of Mr. Collins. Legal paperwork. Recently dated. My stomach tightened slowly as understanding began settling into place piece by piece. Arthur knew something before he died. And whatever he discovered, he had prepared for it. I did not open the envelope immediately. Instead, I sat back down in Arthur's chair holding it carefully in both hands, tracing the familiar shape of his handwriting with my thumb. Arthur had always written my name the same way. Slow. Deliberate. Like it mattered. Outside the study windows, the late afternoon sky had darkened into deep shades of blue and gray. Rain tapped softly against the glass again, gentler this time, almost rhythmic. For a moment I simply listened to it. My entire life with Arthur had been filled with moments like this. Quiet evenings. Shared silence. The kind of marriage people rarely talk about because it is built from ordinary tenderness instead of dramatic gestures. He always warmed my coffee cup before pouring into it because he knew I hated lukewarm coffee. Every winter, he started my car before church so the seats would already be warm when I climbed inside. Even after becoming successful, he still carried grocery bags himself because he believed men should make life lighter for the people they loved. Those small things become enormous after someone is gone. Finally, I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single handwritten letter folded twice. My hands trembled slightly before I unfolded it. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I did not get the extra time I hoped for. First, I need you to know something clearly. None of this was ever your fault. I stopped reading for a second as emotion tightened painfully in my throat. Arthur rarely wrote emotional letters. He preferred saying things directly face to face. Seeing those words on paper unsettled me more than I expected. I continued slowly. I know you always tried to keep peace in this family. That is one of the reasons I loved you from the beginning. But peace and blindness are not the same thing. There are people who mistake kindness for weakness. I should have spoken sooner about what I noticed over the past few years, especially regarding Daniel. He is still our son and I know he loves you. But love becomes fragile when someone spends years teaching a person to feel guilty for loyalty. My chest tightened harder with every sentence. Arthur saw it. He truly saw it all. The distance. The manipulation. The careful way Vanessa repositioned herself at the center of every family decision, while slowly pushing everyone else outward. I remembered countless moments suddenly from a different angle now. Vanessa insisting Daniel skip Sunday dinners because their schedule was too stressful. Vanessa rolling her eyes whenever Arthur discussed family traditions. Vanessa convincing Daniel that setting boundaries meant reducing contact with people who questioned her behavior. Small things, always small enough to sound reasonable. Arthur's letter continued. 3 months ago, I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. Vanessa told Daniel that once I was gone, everything would finally belong to their real family. I do not think Daniel fully understands the consequences of the life he is sleepwalking into. But I knew then I needed to protect you. I lowered the paper slowly into my lap. Their real family. The words echoed painfully through the silent study. After everything Arthur and I sacrificed to build that family, somehow I had become temporary inside it. Replaceable. Disposable once inconvenient. I swallowed hard and continued reading. You once told me something during our first difficult year of marriage. You said, a home stops being a home the moment someone begins making you feel unwanted inside it. I never forgot that. So listen to me carefully now. If they ever make you feel small in that house, do not stay silent simply to keep peace. I leaned back slowly, staring at the final lines. Arthur knew. Not only about Vanessa. About me. About the way I kept swallowing hurt to preserve the appearance of family harmony. There was another page attached behind the letter. Typed legal language this time. I recognized Mr. Collins's signature immediately at the bottom. The document referenced amendments to the Harper Family Trust completed 6 months earlier. My eyes moved quickly across the paragraphs until one section stopped me completely. Under revised conditions of inheritance distribution, any beneficiary found attempting to coerce, intimidate, or pressure Evelyn Harper into relinquishing residency rights within the Lake Forest property shall immediately forfeit entitlement to designated trust assets. I read the sentence 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Arthur had anticipated this. Not vaguely. Specifically. My pulse quickened as pieces finally connected inside my mind. The realtor walkthrough. Vanessa removing Arthur's belongings. The pressure to discuss options. None of it was accidental grief behavior. They believed the house would eventually become theirs if I quietly stepped aside. But Arthur had prepared for exactly that possibility before he died. A sudden knock at the front door startled me sharply. I folded the papers quickly and stood. Through the study window, I saw a black luxury SUV parked outside. Vanessa stepped out holding her phone while Daniel remained in the driver's seat. Even from a distance, I could recognize her expression immediately. Focused. Controlled. Certain. She was not here to comfort me. She was here to continue something she thought was already finished. But for the first time since Arthur's funeral, I no longer felt confused or helpless. I felt awake. I carefully returned Arthur's letter and the legal documents to the drawer before locking it again. My hands were steady now. That surprised me most. For days, grief had made everything feel heavy and blurred, as though I were moving through deep water. But standing there in Arthur's study, hearing the soft sound of Vanessa's heels approaching the front door downstairs, something inside me settled into place. Arthur had left me more than protection. He had left me clarity. By the time I reached the foyer, Vanessa had already let herself inside using her key. She stood near the entry table holding a large white shopping bag from an upscale home organization store. Daniel lingered behind her near the doorway looking uncomfortable. Vanessa smiled brightly the moment she saw me descending the staircase. There you are, she said warmly, as though we were close friends. We brought some storage supplies to help sort through things. I glanced briefly toward the bag filled with labels, folders, and packing materials. Efficient. Organized. Prepared. I did not ask for help sorting anything, I replied calmly. Vanessa's smile flickered for only a second before returning. Evelyn, nobody expects you to handle all this alone. Daniel stepped farther inside and removed his jacket slowly. Mom, we just thought it would make things easier. Easier for whom, I wondered. Vanessa moved toward the living room confidently, already scanning furniture and shelves with the focused expression of someone mentally rearranging property. I also spoke with a realtor friend this morning. she added casually. She specializes in luxury downsizing transitions for seniors. Seniors. Another carefully selected word. Soft enough to sound respectful. Sharp enough to reduce me into a category requiring management. I followed them into the family room where several framed photographs still remained on the mantel. Vanessa immediately picked up one of Arthur holding our grandson Ethan at age 4 during a fishing trip in Wisconsin. This one should probably go to Ethan's room, she said absent-mindedly. Not keep. Not preserve. Redistribute. I watched her closely now in a way I never had before. Arthur was right. Vanessa did not simply like control. She assumed ownership over emotional space itself. Every room she entered slowly reorganized itself around her preferences, until everyone else adjusted automatically. Daniel sat down heavily in Arthur's leather chair, staring at the floor while Vanessa continued moving quietly through the room. I know this is difficult, she said without looking at me, but the sooner we make practical decisions, the healthier it will be emotionally. I almost admired how skillfully she disguised removal as compassion. Practical decisions, I repeated softly. Vanessa nodded immediately. Maintaining this estate costs nearly $30,000 a month between taxes, staff, utilities, and upkeep. Simply does not make sense for one person anymore. Daniel finally spoke. Vanessa has been researching some beautiful communities nearby. Places with dining services, wellness programs, social activities. I turned slowly toward my son. You are discussing where to relocate me less than a week after your father's funeral. His face tightened instantly. Mom, that is not fair. Fair. Such an interesting word from people already measuring curtains while I was still buying sympathy cards. Vanessa sat gracefully on the sofa and crossed her legs. Nobody is forcing anything, she said carefully. We just think this house carries too many memories for you now. That sentence almost made me laugh. Too many memories. As if memories were clutter instead of the only things truly worth keeping. My eyes drifted toward the grand piano near the windows. Arthur bought it for me on our 25th anniversary after hearing me casually mention I missed playing. I never became particularly good again, but every Christmas he still requested the same songs while pretending not to notice my mistakes. That piano had witnessed birthdays, arguments, grandchildren dancing in pajamas, and decades of ordinary family life. Yet to Vanessa, it was likely just another appraisal number waiting to be calculated. She reached into her purse and removed several brochures before sliding them across the coffee table toward me. Senior living communities. Elegant photography. Smiling gray-haired couples holding wine glasses beside golf courses. I did not touch them. This one has an indoor heated pool and private transportation into downtown Chicago, Vanessa explained pleasantly. And this community offers memory support if needed later on. Memory support. There it was. The quiet implication beneath the politeness. Fragile. Aging. Declining. I looked directly at her for several long seconds before finally speaking. You have spent an impressive amount of time planning my future. The room became still. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly again. We are only trying to help, she replied softly. But I noticed something important then. She no longer sounded patient. She sounded irritated. Beneath all the polished manners and careful language, Vanessa expected cooperation. She expected grief to weaken me enough to step aside quietly. And perhaps until today she had been right. My phone suddenly vibrated inside my pocket. A text message from Mr. Collins. We need to speak privately. There are additional details regarding Arthur's trust amendments that should not wait. I looked down at the message once before locking my phone screen again. Then I lifted my eyes toward Vanessa, who was already discussing renovation potential with Daniel in low voices near the windows. Listening to them speak about my home as though I were no longer fully part of it, I finally understood something clearly. They thought the difficult part was over. They believed Arthur's death had removed the only obstacle standing between them and complete control of the Harper legacy. Neither of them realized Arthur had already made his final move. The morning after Daniel and Vanessa brought the retirement community brochures into my home, I woke before sunrise again. But this time, I did not stay in bed staring at the ceiling waiting for grief to swallow the day whole. I dressed carefully in cream slacks and a navy sweater Arthur once said made me look elegant enough to intimidate bankers. Then I walked downstairs and made coffee without crying for the first time since his funeral. The house still felt quieter than it should have, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt observant, almost as if Arthur himself were waiting to see what I would do next. At 9 o'clock sharp, I drove downtown to meet Mr. Collins at his private office instead of the larger conference building where the will reading took place. His assistant led me through a smaller hallway lined with dark wood paneling and framed legal certificates. The room smelled faintly of old books and fresh coffee. Mr. Collins stood when I entered. He had known Arthur for over 30 years, long before Harper Industrial became successful. I still remember the three of us eating takeout Chinese food together during Arthur's first contract dispute, because none of us could afford restaurants back then. "Evelyn," he said gently, "thank you for coming so quickly." I sat across from him and placed my purse carefully beside the chair. "Arthur knew," I said quietly before he could begin. Mr. Collins held my gaze for several seconds before nodding once. "Yes," he answered simply. Hearing someone else confirm it made the truth settle more heavily inside me. Not paranoia. Not grief imagining cruelty where none existed. Arthur saw exactly what was happening before he died. Mr. Collins opened a thin folder and slid several documents toward me. 6 months ago, Arthur requested extensive revisions to the Harper Trust, he explained carefully. At first, I believed he was simply organizing succession planning because of his health concerns. But over time, it became clear he was worried about pressure being placed on you after his death. Pressure. Such a calm word for what Vanessa had already begun doing. Did he explain why? I asked softly. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses. Arthur became concerned after several financial conversations involving Daniel. I frowned slightly. Daniel had never been irresponsible with money before marrying Vanessa. Careless sometimes. Too trusting. But never greedy. Mr. Collins continued. There were discussions about liquidating certain company shares much faster than Arthur believed was wise. Vanessa pushed aggressively for restructuring assets into accounts with fewer restrictions. My stomach tightened slowly. Arthur refused. Repeatedly. Mr. Collins leaned back slightly. Arthur told me something during our final meeting that I have not forgotten. He said, "My son still has a conscience. The problem is he married someone who treats conscience like an obstacle." I lowered my eyes toward the papers in front of me. Hearing Arthur's thoughts spoken aloud after his death felt almost unbearable. He was gone, yet somehow still protecting me through conversations and decisions made months earlier. Mr. Collins slid another document toward me. "There is more." I looked up. Arthur included a conditional clause tied specifically to the Lake Forest property and trust distributions. I already knew part of this from the documents in Arthur's study, but Mr. Collins continued carefully. If any beneficiary attempts to pressure, manipulate, or remove you from your residence through intimidation, financial coercion, or emotional distress tactics, they immediately forfeit access to designated trust assets and controlling company interests. The room became very still. Emotional distress tactics, I repeated quietly. Mr. Collins nodded. Arthur insisted on that wording himself. For the first time in days, I almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Arthur. Calm, precise, ruthless only when absolutely necessary. He knew they would try to push me out, I whispered. Yes, Mr. Collins answered honestly. I believe he did. Outside the office windows, downtown Chicago moved through another gray morning of taxis, umbrellas, and rushing strangers. Meanwhile, my entire understanding of the past decade slowly rearranged itself. Vanessa had not simply disliked me. She viewed me as the final barrier between herself and complete control over the Harper legacy. The house, the company influence, the family image, everything. And Daniel, weak from years of emotional pressure and dependency, had slowly stopped noticing the difference between supporting his wife and abandoning his mother. There is something else you should know, Mr. Collins added carefully. My chest tightened slightly. Arthur instructed me not to intervene immediately unless necessary. He wanted to give Daniel an opportunity to make his own choices after his death. I stared at him silently. Arthur believed people reveal their true character most clearly when money and grief enter the same room. The sentence lingered heavily between us. I thought about the will reading. About Daniel lowering his eyes while Vanessa humiliated me publicly. About the brochure spread across my coffee table less than a week after Arthur died. About strangers scheduling realtor walkthroughs inside the home Arthur and I built together. Mr. Collins folded his hands calmly. Evelyn, I need to ask you something directly. Have they attempted to pressure you into leaving the property? I looked down briefly at the folder before answering. Not openly. Then I lifted my eyes. Again. But they are getting impatient. Mr. Collins nodded once, as though he had expected that answer. Good, he said quietly. Because Arthur prepared for impatience very carefully. When I left his office an hour later, the city looked different somehow. Colder. Sharper. More honest. For the first time since Arthur died, I stopped thinking like a grieving widow trying to preserve peace. And I started thinking like Arthur Harper's wife. 3 nights later, Vanessa hosted what she called a small family dinner at the Lake Forest house. She sent the invitation through a group text filled with heart emojis and phrases about togetherness, healing, and honoring Arthur's memory. I almost admired the performance. Anyone reading those messages would have imagined a loving daughter-in-law trying desperately to keep a grieving family united. But by then I understood Vanessa perfectly. She never created gatherings for emotional connection. She created audiences. The dining room glowed warmly beneath the chandelier that Arthur installed with his own hands nearly 20 years earlier. Vanessa had arranged white roses along the center of the table, and instructed catering staff to prepare an elaborate dinner none of us were emotionally capable of enjoying. Crystal glasses reflected candlelight across polished silverware, while soft jazz music drifted through hidden speakers. Everything looked beautiful. Artificially beautiful. Like a luxury hotel trying to imitate intimacy. Daniel sat halfway down the table beside Vanessa, nervously checking his phone every few minutes. Across from them sat Vanessa's parents, Richard and Claire Bennett, both dressed elegantly and speaking in low voices about market conditions and property taxes, as if this were a business retreat instead of a family dinner following a funeral. My granddaughter Lily smiled politely when I entered, but Ethan barely looked up from his tablet before Vanessa quietly instructed him to put it away. Tonight is about family, she reminded him gently. Family. That word sounded stranger every time she used it. I took my usual seat at the far end of the table. Not the head of the table where Arthur always sat beside me. Vanessa had rearranged seating again. Another small adjustment. Another quiet signal about changing authority inside the house. Dinner moved forward with exhausting politeness. Discussions about schools. Travel plans. Renovation trends in nearby neighborhoods. Nobody mentioned Arthur for nearly 40 minutes. Not his funeral. Not his absence. Not the fact that his favorite chair remained empty only 20 feet away in the next room. It was as if everyone had collectively agreed grief should not interrupt momentum. Finally, Vanessa set down her wine glass and looked toward me with carefully measured sympathy. Evelyn, she said softly, Daniel and I have been thinking a lot about your future. There it was. I folded my napkin slowly across my lap and waited. Vanessa smiled gently, the way people smile at children or patients receiving difficult news. We found a wonderful community in Northbrook that really feels more like a resort than assisted living. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. Vanessa, he muttered quietly, but she continued without missing rhythm. They have private gardens, chef-prepared meals, transportation services, art classes. Honestly, it feels much safer than staying alone in a house this large. Safer. Another carefully selected word. I noticed Claire Bennett nodding approvingly while Richard casually sipped his bourbon. Clearly, this conversation had been rehearsed beforehand. The property market is also extremely strong right now, Richard added calmly. You could sell this place at an excellent valuation. This place. Not your home. Not Arthur's house. A valuation. Numbers replacing memories. Vanessa leaned slightly forward. We are only worried about you feeling isolated here. I looked around the dining room slowly. At the polished mahogany table Arthur spent months restoring himself. At the antique clock beside the fireplace that chimed every hour since Daniel was born. at the walls lined with decades of family photographs Vanessa had not yet removed. Then I looked directly at her. "You seem deeply concerned with where I live," I said quietly. The room became still. Vanessa maintained her smile, though tighter now. "Because we love you," she answered smoothly. Love. Such a useful word when spoken by people trying to take something. Daniel finally spoke up. "Mom, maybe we should at least consider practical options." I turned toward my son carefully. "Practical for whom?" He opened his mouth slightly but said nothing. Silence spread across the table while silverware rested untouched beside expensive meals growing cold. Then Vanessa exhaled softly and set down her napkin with visible frustration for the first time all evening. "Evelyn," she said, dropping some of the sweetness from her voice, "nobody is trying to hurt you. But eventually decisions need to be made. This house, the company interests, the estate management. Daniel cannot spend his life frozen because you are emotionally attached to things." Emotionally attached to things. I almost smiled at how revealing that sentence truly was. To Vanessa, the house was a thing. The company was a thing. Even family itself was mostly a structure surrounding assets and influence. She could not understand why someone would protect memories over efficiency because memories held no market value. "Your father built this house for our family," I said calmly to Daniel. "And your mother still lives in it." Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. Nobody said forever. There it was at last. Honest impatience slipping through polished manners. The room stayed silent for several seconds before a new voice suddenly entered from the doorway behind us. "Actually," Mr. Collins said calmly as he stepped into the dining room holding a leather folder beneath his arm, "Arthur Harper had very specific opinions about forever." Every head at the table turned instantly toward him. Vanessa's expression froze completely. Daniel looked stunned. Mr. Collins walked slowly toward the table with the calm confidence of a man who already knew exactly how this conversation would end. Then he looked directly at me and gave the slightest nod. In that moment I realized something important. Arthur had not left me behind to survive this family alone. He had left instructions. The entire dining room fell silent as Mr. Collins stepped fully inside carrying the leather folder. Against his chest. Even the catering staff near the kitchen doorway stopped moving for a moment, sensing tension thickening beneath the polished surface of the evening. Vanessa recovered first. Of course she did. She stood slowly with a composed smile that looked almost convincing from a distance. "Mr. Collins," she said smoothly, "we were not expecting you." "No," he replied calmly, removing his coat. "But Arthur was." That single sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. Daniel stared at him in confusion while Richard Bennett frowned openly. Claire lowered her wine glass without speaking. I remained seated quietly at the end of the table, watching everything with a stillness I had not felt in years. Mr. Collins approached the table and placed the folder carefully beside my plate before addressing the room in the same measured tone he used during board meetings and courtroom negotiations. Arthur Harper left additional trust instructions to be disclosed under specific circumstances. Vanessa's expression sharpened slightly. "What circumstances?" she asked quickly. Mr. Collins opened the folder without looking at her. "Attempts to pressure Evelyn Harper into surrendering residency rights or relinquishing family holdings through emotional coercion, intimidation, or manipulative financial influence." The room became completely still. I heard Daniel inhale softly beside Vanessa. Richard Bennett straightened in his chair. Claire looked visibly uncomfortable now. Vanessa let out a small laugh that sounded far too controlled to be genuine. "I think there must be some misunderstanding," she said carefully. "Nobody here is coercing Evelyn." Mr. Collins finally looked up at her directly. Arthur anticipated that response. He removed a document from the folder and continued. 6 months ago, Arthur amended the Harper Family Trust with legally binding conditions regarding inheritance distribution. Daniel blinked rapidly. "Dad changed the trust?" "Yes," Mr. Collins answered calmly. After expressing serious concerns regarding repeated discussions surrounding liquidation of assets, forced relocation proposals, and attempts to isolate Evelyn Harper from decision-making. Authority. Vanessa's face lost color almost imperceptibly. "This is ridiculous," she replied sharply. "We were trying to help her." Mr. Collins nodded once. Arthur addressed that possibility specifically. He adjusted the papers slightly before reading aloud. Any beneficiary found exerting direct or indirect pressure upon Evelyn Harper for the purpose of accelerating estate transition or altering residency arrangements shall immediately forfeit access to designated trust assets, controlling company shares, and real property interests. Daniel stared at him in shock. What does that mean exactly? Mr. Collins closed the folder slowly. It means the Lake Forest property remains exclusively under Evelyn Harper's authority for the remainder of her lifetime. It also means that beneficiaries engaging in prohibited conduct lose access to their inheritance distributions. Vanessa stood abruptly from her chair. That is insane. Her polished composure finally cracked completely. You cannot seriously claim normal family discussions qualify as coercion. Actually, Mr. Collins replied evenly, Arthur documented concerns in detail over several months, including witness statements, financial correspondence, and recorded meeting summaries. The silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel looked toward Vanessa with visible confusion now instead of automatic agreement. For the first time since Arthur's funeral, he seemed to realize events were unfolding beyond her control. Vanessa, he said quietly, what financial correspondence? She turned toward him instantly. Daniel, do not do this right now. But something had already shifted. Tiny, fragile, still real. Doubt had finally entered the room. Mr. Collins continued calmly. Arthur loved his family deeply. But he also believed character reveals itself clearly when people begin discussing ownership before grief has settled. No one spoke. Outside the tall dining room windows, rain slid softly across the dark glass while candlelight flickered over untouched plates of expensive food growing cold. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. So what now? She asked bitterly. Evelyn gets everything while the rest of us are treated like criminals. I looked at her quietly for several seconds before finally speaking for the first time since Mr. Collins arrived. No, Vanessa, I said softly. Arthur simply wanted to make sure I was treated like family. My voice remained calm, but the words landed heavily. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. Vanessa looked stunned, perhaps because she expected anger instead of clarity. Mr. Collins slid one final envelope across the table toward me. Arthur asked that this be delivered personally once all conditions were met. I opened it carefully. Inside was a short handwritten note in Arthur's familiar steady handwriting. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then you finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in your own life. I smiled before I could stop myself. Tears gathered briefly in my eyes, but they no longer felt helpless. Across the table, Vanessa looked smaller somehow. Not because she lost money. Because for the first time, she could no longer control the story being told in the room. Daniel stared at the table silently for several moments before finally speaking in a strained voice. Mom, I did not know any of this. I believed him. That was the tragedy of it. Vanessa manipulated directly. Daniel surrendered gradually. One through ambition. The other through weakness. I folded Arthur's note carefully and placed it back into the envelope before standing slowly from the table. Your father spent his entire life building this family, I said quietly to Daniel. But somewhere along the way, everyone became more concerned with inheriting his money than inheriting his decency. No one answered. They could not. I looked around the dining room one final time. At the chandelier Arthur installed himself. At the family photographs still hanging on the walls. At the home we built together through decades of sacrifice, loyalty, and ordinary love. Then I realized something important. Arthur did not leave me a fortune to protect me from strangers. He left it to protect me from people who forgot what family was supposed to mean. And for the first time since his death, the house no longer felt empty, felt like mine.